election series. This is the post-election analysis with Dr. Andra Gillespie. I am grateful to introduce her. Dr. Gillespie is an associate professor of political science and director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute at Emory University, College of Arts and Sciences. She earned her Bachelor's of Arts degree in Government and Foreign Affairs and African American Studies from the University of Virginia. She went on to earn a Master of Arts in African American Studies and a Master of Philosophy and Political Science from Yale University, where she also earned her doctorate in 2005. Before joining the faculty at Emory, she worked as an analyst for Democratic pollster Mark Mellman. Dr. Gillespie's teaching portfolio includes numerous classes on race and politics in the United States. She teaches the undergraduate survey course in African American politics, as well as a specialized course called New Black Political Leadership. She has also taught courses in political participation, experimental methods, and race and elections. You have probably seen Dr. Gillespie all over the media for several months, especially in the last couple of days. And I just want to express my gratitude for her for joining us tonight. She's incredibly busy, and we are so grateful that she is sharing her expertise with us. And with that, I will invite Dr. Gillespie to present.
I was muted. Thank you very much, Lane, for this very kind introduction. I am just about to share my screen. I apologize because I've been thinking about what I was going to say and then had to put it together sort of as I was watching election events unfold. So I think I'm going to tell a different story of the 2020 election and then leave time for some of the questions that you might have based on the generic things, excuse me, that we have been talking about in the news. And so I thought it would actually be somewhat creative to tell this story through the lens of 4 Black candidates. And this allows us to tell a really rich and interesting story of African-American politics in the current moment. So the 4 stories I'm going to tell you about are US Senate candidate Jaime Harrison from South Carolina, Michigan Senate candidate John James, Congresswoman Lauren Underwood from Illinois, and Kanye West. And Kanye West is pretty much a stand-in for Black rappers, and I'll explain how that is important in a second. So let me start with Jaime Harrison. I just did a Google search, sort of did the news search to see what came up, and then I went further back in the feed to not talk about the stuff that's happened in the last couple of days, but to look at kind of where Harrison got on the map. So of course, Harrison is the former chair of the South Carolina Democratic Party. He was the Democratic nominee against Lindsey Graham, who was considered an embattled candidate. So he is somebody who, had incurred rightward challenge in his previous re-election bid when he was running for his party's nomination in 2014. And some people thought that perhaps he was too closely tied to President Trump, and thus he might actually be seriously weak as a result of it. And Harrison gained national notoriety because of his prodigious fundraising. And if we looked at some public polls that came out in the summer, it looked like this race was closer than one would expect a race would be in South Carolina, which is heavily Republican. Of course, we all know what happened. Graham won actually pretty easily with 56% of the vote on Tuesday. And so many people are asking what's wrong. Why would the polls be wrong? And so now polling is coming under indictment. People are always wondering like why things didn't happen right. I think there's actually a lesson to be learned here. So I just pulled this screenshot from Real Clear Politics that compiled a lot of the public polling that was available in the South Carolina race. This one looks a little bit different from the compilation that 538 will put together because they were pulling from data sources I've never heard of before that they actually didn't like if you look at their rating. But let's look at what we see here. One, in terms of the public polling that Real Clear is compiling here for its average, polling was somewhat sporadic for a race that was supposed to be as competitive as it was. And so you looked at, even if I just do the screenshot of sort of the most recent polls, that goes back actually to the beginning of this year at the end of January. And yeah, there are these notable polls from Quinnipiac in in July and in September that suggested that the race was a tie, but all of the other public polls that are on this list gave Graham an edge. And yeah, those margins were often within the statistical margin of error, but perhaps we should be more circumspect. And we do have to ask the question about how come it didn't predict, these polls weren't as decisive in terms of actually predicting what Graham's vote totals were. I'd have to pour through the specs, and I don't always have access to what the top line data are so that I could get a sense of how polls are weighted or what the demographic composition of the sample actually looks like. But that's often a key place where we see people making errors. And so if a poll overweights, for instance, African-American voters, if they don't turn out at rates that were expected in the population, if you underweight rural voters or voters with non-college educations, that was the problem of 2016, that might actually end up sort of altering the horse race results to skew them and make them less accurate. But I think that there's a really sort of important lesson from this. So aside from paying attention to the margins of error and understanding that those are confidence intervals that will help to bracket a range of possible vote totals for the candidates. So instead of just looking at this ECU poll at the top that says Harrison is going to get 46% of the vote, think about that. My margin of error is saying, you know what, the range is going to be somewhere around 42 to 50%, as opposed to saying, ooh, Harrison came in at 42%, so therefore the poll is wrong. We have to be really careful about how we do this. Now, this doesn't completely explain Graham. Graham's the one that's outside of the margin of error here, but we have to sort of just be really careful about how we interpret polls and not ask them to do too much. And I think we are asking polls to do too much. The other big lesson for this is to just keep in mind that polls are only as good as the moment that they're in the field. People change their minds, people update based on new information. And if we're not constantly in the field tracking those things, we won't notice this. So one of the things that I find interesting in terms of the public polls is that this most recent poll was in the field at the end of October, a full week and a half before the election was over. That in and of itself is a problem. A lot could change, a lot could happen, people change their minds. And so perhaps we shouldn't be surprised about the poll result that we see. This actually reminds me a lot of the problem in Michigan and Wisconsin in particular in 2016, where a lot of public polling in the presidential race stopped there early because they assumed that Clinton was going to win. And then people were surprised when she lost on election day 2016. So the moral of this story is expect people to change their minds. And if we're not measuring things, constantly, we won't know it. Now, I will say, I have no explanation right now for why Maine was as screwy as it was. This doesn't make any sense. Other people, perhaps people who are closer to sort of the ground in Maine politics can perhaps answer the question. One of the things that's actually really interesting to me about these polls is that the polls that were the least sanguine about Sarah Gideon's chances happen to be the ones that were actually local. And so this is actually sort of a really important lesson about people who drop into communities that they don't understand. We'd have to go back and dig through the weeds, but perhaps their assumptions about what the composition of the electorate looks like, what the regional variation should look like, what the regional specs should look like, are very different. And that's actually leading to weighting errors that end up skewing results. So I think we're going to be spending a long time trying to understand how Susan Collins pulled off her upset victory or her come from behind victory, which may not have ever been a come from behind victory, but I do acknowledge that there are places where there's some head scratchers going on here. So next I want to move to Michigan, and I want to talk about a Black Republican candidate, John James. John James is a military veteran who was the Republican nominee for the US Senate both this year and in 2018. He lost narrowly in both elections. One of the concerns that people have had in the literature is whether Black Republican candidates are particularly disadvantaged because of their race. People have talked about the historic disadvantages that Black candidates face, but we're usually discussing that in a Democratic context. Are there additional hurdles for Black Republican candidates who have to win over a large segment of white voters in order to be able to win, because most African-American voters would be predisposed to vote against them on party lines, first and foremost? And so my friend, colleague, and co-author Tyson King Meadows studied Michael Steele's failed Senate campaign in Maryland in 2006. And one of his findings was that Steele underperformed relative to presidential and gubernatorial candidates who had run in Maryland around the same time that he did. So while Steele actually increased his vote share in predominantly African-American counties in Maryland because of extensive outreach efforts to those communities, he actually ends up underperforming in the traditionally Republican parts of the state, which were less racially diverse. And so this asks a question about whether or not African-American Republican candidates might actually be facing some implicit biases within their own party that would disadvantage them relative to their white counterparts. So James is a really important lesson for me, in part because one of my students kind of got me into this. So Elias Nebart, who graduated from Emory College this past spring, was in my class, New Black Political Leadership, when I taught it last fall. And so they had to do a major paper. It's a research class to complete the major in political science. And so he looked at 2018 election results by county in Michigan. And he actually didn't find evidence that James significantly underperformed relative to both Trump in 2016 and the Republican gubernatorial candidate, Bill Shute, who was running at the same time that he was. So in particular, if you look at the correlations, just the simple Pearson's R correlations between the James vote by county and the Trump vote or the Shute vote, I mean, it's actually almost monotonic, particularly in the gubernatorial race. So James was getting basically the same number of votes per county that his Republican counterparts were getting. So I was very curious to see if James did the same thing in this particular election. I have to admit, my interest was piqued by Chris Christie coming out of the blue on George Stephanopoulos on Sunday saying that John James was going to be a US Senator. And it turns out he actually underperforms this time around. So the correlation is still high, still very strong, but it's only at 0.9. It's not as high as it was in 2018. And because I just put this together, I'm happy to talk about it and speculate a little bit more, but I'd have more work to do to sort of examine what the why behind this. All right, so how does this fit into a larger story? Let's talk about other Senate candidates. So one of the things that was actually really interesting about this cycle was that Democrats were hoping to take control of the chamber. There's still the possibility that they could tie in the Senate if Democrats win both of the Georgia Senate races that are going to a runoff at this point. But if we look at the other Senate candidates who ran, it didn't look like Donald Trump's coattails were particularly damaging to them. And so the correlation between the Trump vote in these states and what the Senate candidates got is relatively high. And if we, look at sort of certain races, like, for instance, the Susan Collins race in Maine, she's actually substantially overperforming President Trump. So that suggests that while polarization is real and while partisan tribal identities are a real thing, that there perhaps is still a personal vote. So there's still a certain measure of incumbency advantage for those who have it. And they are, able to use that so that they might be able to do as well, if not slightly better, than President Trump in certain circumstances. So let me talk about Lauren Underwood. And so I want to tell an intersectional partisan story here. So Underwood is a nurse by training, and she represents the Illinois 14th district. So it's one of the Chicago suburbs. It's a majority white district. It's actually a very, very white district demographically. And that's a typo there, I apologize. She's not an ideological firebrand. So she is not one of the members of the squad per se. So Underwood is currently in an uphill battle to defeat her Republican challenger this election. And she's actually one of 2 Black members of Congress right now. The other, Steve Horsford of Nevada, who actually is ahead in his race at the moment, whose races are too close to call. This is actually really interesting. As I was going over the map and going over districts that didn't have colors in them yet on the New York Times website, I was surprised to see this because we're not used to seeing embattled African-American candidates at the general election level. Yes, it happens sometimes in primary races when you get a challenge, and even there, that's somewhat rare, but it wouldn't be unusual for an upstart candidate to try to challenge a long-term incumbent in a majority Black district where you have 2 Blacks running against each other. So Barack Obama tried tried this unsuccessfully in 2000 when he ran against Bobby Rush. And we saw it happen this cycle in Missouri, where Cori Bush beat William Lacey Clay. We might actually have to get used to seeing more of these kinds of races where you see Black candidates, particularly ones who are representing districts that are not majority Black or not even close to being majority minority, who may actually end up, because of the partisan balance and nature of the district, be in more competitive positions. And so they may not serve as long as we're used to seeing. Alan Gerber in the late 1990s, found that African Americans had the greatest seniority of members of Congress, in part because they didn't retire to go run for other seats, because their chances of being able to win statewide office or to run for president of the United States were slim to none. So they tended to stay in their congressional seats as long as their constituents would have them, which was pretty much as long as they wanted to, barring some type of major scandal. And so we're used to seeing long-term incumbency. That may not be a feature of Black politics, particularly if the number of Black members of Congress expands, because it's expanding outside of majority minority districts. So it's just interesting food for thought, and another thing to think about as we sort of challenge our assumptions about African-American politics. But this is also important because Underwood is not alone. And so you may have heard the story of how Republicans have actually picked up seats in the House of Representatives. Not enough to be able to take over the chamber, but enough to be noticed, and enough that this is going to cause some conversation within the Democratic caucus going forward, at the end of this cycle, and then also in terms of picking leadership in the next Congress. And so I'm pulling data from the Center for American Women in Politics from Rutgers University. And so I'm very grateful to my friend Kelly Dittmar for putting this together. And so they are actively tracking the number of women who have been elected to Congress. We knew that this was another record-breaking year for women running for office, particularly women of color, and wanted to see sort of where the tallies were so far. So we know that the current Congress, the 116th Congress, has the greatest number of women in Congress ever. So women make up a full approximately 25% of both the House and the Senate. And it looks like the 117th Congress is on track to do just about the same. And so, we'll see a small increase in the number of women who are elected to Congress, but note the partisan breakdown if we look at these, at the two bottom lines. So this breaks down representation by party. And so what we're seeing is that the increase is largely because more Republican women are getting elected to Congress in this cycle, and we have seen some losses among Democratic women. Now, on the one hand, this is actually sort of room for celebration, because as we talked about 2019 being the year of the woman, as the 116th Congress was ushered in, we had to note that it was particularly lopsided and that Republican women were seriously underrepresented in Congress. So Republican women have a long ways to go in terms of catching up to their Democratic sisters, but progress was being made. And so I think the question is, when can we see the day where we're seeing gains in gender representation on both the Democratic and the Republican side simultaneously? So as women who were representing some of these suburban districts that are more electorally competitive are embattled, we're seeing Republican women make gains, and we'll see whether or not these gains are sustainable over a long period of time. So finally, I want to talk about Kanye West. I want to talk about him in the context of his third-party challenge, but also to talk about the complicated relationship that many people are observing between Blacks and party identification, but Black men in particular with party identification. So, we all know that West ran as a third-party candidate. He invented his own party called the Birthday Party and announced a bid for president in late summer. There were lots of reasons why this campaign was a failure. One, there are the rumors about who was boosting it, and we could talk about the ethics of putting forward a candidate who was obviously struggling with a diagnosed mental illness. But there were also other reasons historically why third-party challenges don't seem to work. So in the United States, we have a two-party system, and because most of our elections are single-member districts and plurality votes. So whoever gets the most votes in the district wins. That tends to lend itself to two-party systems. And when you have two-party systems, it's hard for third parties to break through. So third parties either break through to play spoiler to one of the existing two parties, or when a party is particularly weak and on its way out, to replace one of the two existing parties and to become one of the two major parties in and of itself. So West entered the race too late to be a real spoiler. He was never particularly organized. And in terms of being able to articulate a certain grievance and being able to attract a cadre of Black, presumably Democratic voters around him, he was just not the vessel for articulating those tensions and those frustrations. So to be sure, there are frustrations between African Americans and the Democratic Party. Paul Freimer describes the relationship as what he calls a democratic electoral capture. So because the Democratic Party is overwhelmingly perceived as the party that is most likely to address civil rights issues in a favorable way, most African Americans feel compelled to support the Democratic Party, even when they feel that the party doesn't exactly support the same issues that they care about, or actually give them enough attention, both during campaigns and actually out of campaign season. So this was some of, the frustration that somebody like the rapper Ice Cube was articulating, but this is a long-standing critique of the Democratic Party that goes back for more than a generation. It has been expressed in multiple ways. We could look at the leverage candidacy of Jesse Jackson in 1984, 1988. In particular, in 1988, when, because he finished in second place in the Democratic primaries, he was actually able to leverage increased Black representation and leadership in the DNC and party platform changes that actually reflected African-American support of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. So I think the question here is whether or not Ice Cube and Lil Wayne are in a position to be able to articulate Black frustrations with the Democratic Party and usher in a type of realignment. I could have put Candace Owens on here with her open talk for the Blexit. And the truth is, I'm not sure any of these people are actually sort of, on the vanguard of a new secular realignment of Blacks away from the Democratic Party. However, I do look at Ice Cube and Lil Wayne as actually fitting a larger historical trend of Republican outreach efforts to African-American communities. So they seem to fall in the Black capitalism strain of Republican Party outreach to African-Americans. This was a strategy that Richard Nixon used pretty successfully, actually. Relatively speaking, Richard Nixon has gotten more African-American votes proportionally than any Republican candidate since 1964, including Donald Trump. So the idea of Black capitalism is that the Republican Party, with its pro-business, low-tax ethos, is a party that could actually be used to advance economic development. So if you've heard President Trump take credit for the opportunity zones, know that that idea came from Senator Tim Scott, the lone Black Republican in the US Senate. Also, this is also part of larger outreach efforts to African-American communities. So we could go back and look at George W. Bush's outreach efforts to African-Americans. So whether it is the framing of his campaign in terms of compassionate conservatism, his opening of the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives to reach out to religious communities, including African-American churches, even making sure that the staging of the Republican National Convention was racially and ethnically diverse. These were all efforts that Tasha Philpott noted were done to try to increase Republican vote share among Blacks. And it worked to the margins. And so we have to acknowledge the effectiveness here. President Trump's outreach efforts to African-American communities are confounded by his incendiary rhetoric and his outreach to white supremacists at the same time. But there are people who did respond to the message and to the targeted outreach efforts that particularly attacked Joe Biden with respect to his prior positions on crime policy and Kamala Harris's former position as being a district attorney. So I've included this graph here that looks at Republican presidential vote share by race, going back to Bill Clinton's reelection in 1996. And so what we can see is that just like George W. Bush, Donald Trump improved his vote share among Blacks by 3 percentage points, according to exit polls this year. Overall, if we look, we'll see that Trump got a lower vote share amongst whites. And so actually, Joe Biden's vote share amongst whites is at 43%, which actually puts him in the same ballpark area of Bill Clinton and Al Gore in the late 90s and the early 2000s, and actually somewhat close, maybe a little bit better by a point, if I recall, to John Kerry in 2004. And we do see some fluctuation and variation sort of in terms of support for Trump in Asian American and Hispanic communities. People are wringing their hands about the numbers that they're seeing, and there are numbers in various states that does look a little bit different. But one of the things that we should point out is that if we look at sort of the Latino vote share, it's not actually that different from what we know about Latino partisanship. So as my colleague Bernard Fraga would say, if you're ever perplexed about why 30% of Latinos vote Republican, you should remember that about 30% of Latinos are Republican. So this is a story of party identification, more so than anything else. All right, so I'm still very, very interested in what makes Black Republicans tick. And this is actually a really hard research project because most survey data really doesn't include many Black Republican respondents. So, you know, most, if you're looking at national survey data that has samples of 1,000 to 1,500 people, you're usually only looking at a couple of hundred Black respondents at best. And if about 10% of Blacks are Republican, then you're looking at, you know, anywhere from 10 to 20 Black Republican respondents, and you can't do anything with that. So my colleagues and I do have a project, and so I'm going to pull from the first survey that we did, because it was the one I could access easier today, which was the 2015 survey of continuing Black partisanship. And here are some of the things that we find, and here's the puzzle that we're still actively trying to figure out. So some people might say, well, maybe it's religion. So maybe the African Americans who are more likely to be Republican are more religious. And so it is in fact true that particularly since most African Americans identify as Christian, that if we look at those who identify as being evangelical, that there are proportionally more Black Republicans who identify as evangelical than proportionally as Democrats. But the thing is that about half of Black Democrats identify as being evangelical. So this is not a story about religion. Similarly, it's not really a story about ideology. So when we look at American politics broadly, one of the reasons why we have polarization is because of this phenomenon called ideological sorting. So once upon a time in the mid-20th century, in the United States, the Democratic and the Republican parties were big tents. And there was a lot of ideological heterogeneity within both parties, which meant that there were liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats. It actually helped making negotiations in Congress easier because you had them both there in large number and in leadership positions. And there were ways for people to be able to find common ground. Increasingly, what we're seeing is that liberals are Democrats and conservatives are Republicans. And so what that means is that there is this fast shrinking middle. There are fewer moderates. It's not a surprise that you're seeing Democrats become embattled if they happen to be more centrist Democrats. We've been witnessing that happen amongst centrist Republicans for more than a decade now. So it's now coming home to roost within the Democratic Party. Now, what we've observed about ideological sorting is largely based on what we know about white behavior. It hasn't completely happened yet with people of color. And it's in part those brand perceptions about which party is better on racial issues are important. And so for African Americans, though about a third of Blacks will identify ideologically as conservative, the vast majority of those conservative Blacks will not join the Republican Party because they perceive the party to be racist. So this isn't a story of ideology for African Americans, even though ideology can be a significant predictor of party identification. The story that we often think about in African American politics is this seminal theory in Black politics called linked fate. Linked fate is this idea that if an African American believes that what happens to other Blacks affects them, that they will then use what we call a Black utility heuristic and make political decisions, not just based on their own personal self-interest, but in the interest of the group. And so when they're making policies about who to vote for, what party they should be a part of, whether or not they should support policies like affirmative action or social welfare spending and the like. Blacks who are more likely to have linked fate are going to be more likely to support those policies, even if they personally don't feel that they're going to benefit from them, because they're thinking about the larger group community. And that idea of thinking about the group or group consciousness is born out of years of being discriminated against and years of class not working for African Americans in the same way that it might work for whites. So African Americans are always being treated as though they're a member of a group, and so they behave politically like they're part of a group. So using the theory of linked fate, one might easily hypothesize that African Americans who perhaps don't subscribe to linked fate, who don't think that what happens to other Blacks affects them, might be the ones who would be most likely to be Republicans. This is also not borne out by the data. Levels of linked fate are almost identical in our survey sample of African American Democrats and African American Republicans. So we have to go back to the drawing board. So here's what may be happening, and we're still working through this and trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. We've wanted to create an index where instead of just using one question to try to explain the world, we want to use a series of questions and put them together. But the problem is that people won't answer the questions in the same way. So here are some things that we do see. So one, we do note that Black Republicans do seem to be more skeptical of federal government intervention than Black Democrats. We ask this on a number of different dimensions, like who should be in charge of healthcare, who should be in charge of addressing policy, who should be in charge of, addressing gun safety, who should be in charge of taxation, who should be in charge of defense. So there are places where Black Democrats and Republicans agree. They agree that defense is the purview of the federal government. There are places where Black Republicans do seem to be more skeptical of federal government intervention. The problem is it's not consistent. They can't actually agree that if it's not federal government, then what? There is this sort of diversity of opinion on the proper role of government on issues related to poverty, healthcare, et cetera. So some people would say it's up to individuals to get themselves out of poverty. Other people might look to another level of government or to the private sector. And so it's that heterogeneity of opinion that's actually making it somewhat difficult to model. And then if we look at this sort of notion of independence, right? So Blacks, even Black Republicans have linked fate. But what does that look like in terms of whether or not they express sort of the idea that they are individuals and should be treated as such and that they are independent thinkers? The issue here is that it's actually a little bit muddled. So let me just show you some examples from cross tabulations. So we asked people dyad. So we asked them to sort of pick which statement they actually preferred first. So the top one suggests that you could either pick between believing that racial discrimination is the main reason why many Black people can't get ahead these days, or you could agree more with the statement that Blacks who can't get ahead on their own are mostly responsible for their own condition. So here we do see partisan variation. Republicans are more likely to say that Blacks can't get ahead because it's their own fault, and Democrats are more likely to say that racial discrimination is the main reason why Blacks can't get ahead. However, if we look at the other two dyads, Black Republicans and Democrats tend to agree. So for instance, Democrats and Republicans both say that, you know what, you're never going to get rid of racism. So Blacks should just try to be the best that they can be, and regardless of what American society throws at them. And we see high levels of agreement with the idea that Blacks should try to gain as much political power as possible. So basically, if you're going to look at the argument between W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, Du Bois wins here, and he wins amongst Black Democrats and Black Republicans. So the things that I blocked out here are independents just because it was 8 of them in the survey. So here's what we're going to look at. If we're going to look at beliefs in individualism, we do see divergence. But one of the things that's actually really interesting in the red is that if we look at sort of the people who are in the middle categories, there's a lot of variation. So the poles are polarized, but the middle isn't necessarily as polarized. So that's what's making this a little bit interesting. So yeah. Black Republicans are more likely to strongly agree with the idea that Blacks can make up their own political decisions without having Black leaders explain things to them. And Black Democrats are more likely to strongly disagree, but it's not many people at all. And then if we look at the idea of Blacks should try to do as much as possible for themselves before they start thinking of others, yeah, you will see greater subscription to that amongst Black Republicans than Black Democrats, and the opposite here. But again, the vast majority of folks are in the middle. on this, on both sides of the aisle. And then this idea that that the Democratic Party is too controlling over Black political thought is an idea that, relatively speaking, is more likely to be subscribed to by Black Republicans, more likely to be rejected by Black Democrats. But again, there are African-American Democrats and Republicans who were kind of in the middle on this. And so as I'm thinking through this and thinking about whether or not we're ever going to run another survey where you have to pay extra to get Black Republican respondents, one of the things we're thinking about is in terms of measurement. We usually give people binary choices, it's kind of an either or. And so I think this is more of a both and proposition. And then it's a to what extent does this actually happen? So as I conclude, I want to sort of think about what these stories have to do with the larger American government project. As a scholar of African-American politics, we often have to fight within the field for recognition that this isn't sort of a niche academic pursuit, but that the stories that we're telling here about race and politics are really important stories that actually sort of serve as a barometer for the health of American government and institutions, broadly speaking. I would use the metaphor of the miner's canary that Lonnie Guinier at Harvard University and Gerald Torres would talk about. So, in mining, in the old days, miners would take a canary into the coal mine, and if the canary died, that's when you knew there was no oxygen and you needed to get out. And so in many ways, African Americans and other people of color are the canaries in the coal mine. So if people of color are doing poorly, then that is a sign that America in and of itself is not doing well at all. So I think that there's some things that we can learn about this larger American project, and part of it is to just add greater complexity and nuance to our understanding about what's going on. So yes, we still see in this election 92% of African Americans voting for Joe Biden. However, there's incredible heterogeneity beneath the surface. So we could look at opinion, we could look at political experience and try to figure out what makes folks different and how even when they're coming from different places, they end up arriving at sort of the same conclusions when it comes to who to vote for candidates, or when they diverge in terms of certain types of policy preferences. And this is actually really interesting because it creates this challenge and this puzzle about how to be creative with our measurements. And so, for nerdy things, instead of like saying, I'm going to give you 5 choices, maybe I'm going to do some sliding scales with the same questions just to see what type of variation I get going forward. So I'm sure that there are lots of questions about sort of the overall sort of election results, which I know I haven't spoken a whole lot about here, but I would love to entertain those questions, and I'm happy to talk about sort of the latest findings, and the latest updates in the election now. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gillespie. And I'll just reiterate that ask if anyone who has questions in the audience, go ahead and submit them to the Q&A platform. One of the first questions we came in had to do with Kanye West's immediate pivot to a 2024 run. Do you see any sort of leadership following him with that campaign?
No, at this point, I'm more concerned about Kanye West's mental health. And, if he is, able to stabilize and then think about his ideas, if he can put an organization together, maybe, but I think probably what he's being motivated by, if it's not his personal struggles, it's the notoriety that Ice Cube and Lil Wayne have gotten in the last couple of weeks. And so, the thing that I think about when I think about this is, one of the things that is interesting, it's not something that I think about because I have to admit I'm not the biggest consumer of hip hop, is the affinity that Donald Trump has with rappers. I actually had to ask one of my students when President Trump, made his speech about how he was going to the Supreme Court to stop the count. I couldn't help but notice somebody who looked like they were affiliated with the hip hop community sitting front and center. And so one of my students had to tell me it was Lil Pump. We'd forgotten the ways that Donald Trump had been invoked in rap lyrics for decades. And so it fits with that notion of Black capitalism that some of my colleagues, who are really used to critiquing capitalism. I'm thinking of my friend Lester Spence, who wrote this book called Knocking the Hustle. And he's like against the neoliberal turn in Black politics. But we forget that there's actually a lot about hip hop that is in fact neoliberal. And so, as much as people critique capitalism, there are many African Americans who embrace it, including in the hip hop community. And so they found an affinity with Donald Trump because they viewed sort of what he was able to achieve as sort of being the ultimate hustle in a positive sense in that particular way. The vast majority of African Americans reject that point of view. They are looking at the incendiary racial rhetoric. They are looking at the lack of safety. They are looking at his insensitivity towards concerns about policing, and they're moving in another direction. And so if Kanye West can't articulate that, then I don't think he's going to get a good following. And I also think that there are other African-American leaders who are on the horizon who are in a much better position to be able to make those critiques and would actually probably get a bigger audience than him.
Great, thank you so much. The next question is, what is the data saying about Kamala Harris's impact on voting patterns during this cycle?
So overall, if we look at the exit polls, they did ask favorability questions about both Trump and Biden, but also Mike Pence and Kamala Harris. In general, more people responded to the questions about Biden and Pence, and it seems like the intensity was on Biden and Trump, excuse me. And so the intensity seemed to be more greatly focused on the presidential candidates than the vice presidential candidates, which is normal. So in a presidential election, it is the top of the ticket that matters. The vice presidents don't matter. What Senator Harris had to do was prove that she would be ready on day one to take over should something happen to President Trump. If she had floundered in that, if she had a disastrous interview where she, couldn't tell you what newspaper she read, that would have reflected poorly on Joe Biden and his judgment and decision making. And there we might have actually seen a drag in vote support. But I don't anticipate that when people run the numbers on this race that she's actually going to be a drag on the ticket. And it looked like people who liked her were very inclined to support Joe Biden based on what I was able to see in the exit polls.
Wonderful. What strategies do you see to counteract ideological sorting, maybe especially drawing on lessons learned from the Black community and their lower incidence of sorting?
So if racism weren't an issue in the United States, I expect Blacks would ideologically sort. So, I mean, this is artificial in African American communities, but because race is such a salient identity, because it is such a strong predictor of life chances, African Americans make decisions based on their racial identities. If race weren't a salient, then we would see other identities start to come to the forefront, and we would start to see a little bit more variation. So, in general, what do we need to do, to mitigate the polarization that we see? Some of it, could be changing how we think about people in different parties, which is incredibly difficult to do in this time. I think one of the big lessons of what we have learned from this last election is even if Joe Biden wins, which he looks like he's in better shape to win than Donald Trump right now, this country is still going to be incredibly divided. And it's going to take a lot to bring people together. So unfortunately, I don't think we've hit rock bottom yet. And it hurts me to say that. So if we are going to do this differently, I think we're going to have to learn to tamp down on negative partisanship. So negative partisanship is an idea that is heavily promoted by my colleague Alan Abramowitz, which is the idea that you choose your party because you know that you're not with the other people, that you don't agree with them, that they're different. And I think that, when taken to its extremes, this leads to othering. Right. And it leads to the type of dangerous behavior where people feel that they are justified in saying that they're going to kidnap the governor of Michigan and put her on trial and execute her. That sounds like a terrible, bad plot from old Western TV shows. Right. But they can do that because they don't see Gretchen Whitmer as a person. They don't see her as a person who they may disagree with on issues. They just see her as the ultimate threat. And so we're going to have to learn to be very intentional about our language. I think we need to be very careful when we are angry to not act out viscerally. So even though we want to speak truth to power, I think we need to make sure that we're always diplomatic and civil in how we express our disagreements. I think we also have to have room for people to disagree and also have room for grace so that if people make mistakes, that they are given an opportunity to be able to learn from their mistakes. I think the other thing that we're going to have to do is be intentional and reach outside of our bubbles and form real relationships with people who disagree with us. And that's incredibly hard to do. And even, I found myself in my life, my mom was telling me about a conversation that she was having with a relative. And I just realized that I was like, I don't want to hear anything that this person has to say right now. And there's some personal stuff that's tied up in there, but it was also sort of this recognize of how rabid our politics has become, that I was just ready to dismiss out of hand, like anything that this person had to say. Now, I thought my mom was being too nice to him, but it was a lesson that, I have to remind myself that to do the same thing and to not other people.
Great. I love your adjective of rapid. I feel like that's very appropriate these days. Another question that's come in, what lessons from the Black community struggles are resonant and informative with the growing Hispanic community going forward?
So it's important for us to understand that the experiences of different racial and ethnic groups are different in the United States. And so we can't uniformly apply theories that have worked in African-American politics to Latino and Asian American communities without sort of updating them or understanding that they may not work. So, one of the things that I will say is that there have been studies about linked fate and group consciousness in Hispanic or Latinx communities, and there is evidence that it exists there, but it has to be filtered through sort of the historical understanding of how these communities sort of experienced entry into the United States, how they were raced and othered, what the differences are in ethnicity. And so one of the things that we're learning in African-American politics from Asian American and Latino politics is to think about immigration status, because we're seeing growing numbers of Black immigrants to the United States from Africa and the Caribbean, maybe even Europe. And so we have to be more mindful of immigrant experiences and make sure that we include those stories, in our analyses as well. But that looks very different than the experiences that we have in, when we're looking at, Latino politics. So for instance, we wouldn't automatically, even while we're thinking of immigrant status, we wouldn't think about, if you're doing something with the Latino community, you might want to make distinctions if you're going to be studying partisanship between Cuban Americans and say Mexican Americans, right? So you have this historically Republican group that's Republican for really important historical reasons. It's fleeing Castro. It's ending up in the South with a Democratic Party that was hostile to them. It's Kennedy botching the Bay of Pigs invasion. So there are all of these reasons why Cuban Americans are Republican, and they look different from their Mexican American counterparts or their Puerto Rican counterparts. Religiosity works different. So while, being evangelical doesn't matter for African Americans, it matters more in some Hispanic communities. And so we have to sort of understand that we sometimes are looking at the same variables, but we have to give space to experience and to understand that that experience might filter and register different types of experience, different types of outcomes in terms of sort of, what types of behavior conclusions people come to.
Thank you so much. We're going to end with one more question. What impact do you think Stacey Abrams had on Georgia elections this year?
So I think that's a long-term game. And so, especially as people have been incredibly impatient with trying to get election results. I said this someplace else, but I'll say it here. I know our friends in psychology, can tell us about the studies of deferred gratification in kids with marshmallows. We are not 4-year-olds with marshmallows in front of us that we're being told we can't eat. We can wait. We'd rather count the vote tallies accurately than mess things up in order to be hasty or to fulfill the desires of the president. And so as we are thinking about this, the same lesson should be applied to Democratic politics in the state. So I've had reporters ask me for the better part of a decade, when is Georgia going to turn blue? The DPG put out this memo saying Georgia is on the cusp of turning Democratic. And, 8 years ago, I would have been incredibly skeptical of that type of pronouncement. Not that I couldn't see the horizon and where it was coming, but I was like, wow, you are placing a lot of hope on a bunch of teenagers of color, expecting them to vote in their first election in which they're eligible. And I still hold true to that. But over time, the demography was certainly turning in Democrats' favor. And what Stacey Abrams deserves credit for is seeing that years in advance when she put the New Georgia Project together and creating a model that first she uses in the nonpartisan arena, but then she translated over to the partisan arena where she was able to identify latent voters, get them registered, create an education program to get them acclimated to the voting process and to help mobilize them so that they become regular parts of the Georgia electorate. Now, the New Georgia Project is, only about halfway to its larger term goal of registering 1 million new voters in Georgia, but it's just the idea that that infrastructure was starting to be created, in 2013, I think is really important. And I think for people who are doing work, you have to understand that this is not instantaneous work. It takes time. So, I think Stacey Abrams deserves all the credit that she has been given for helping to sort of build the infrastructure that at the time a pretty weak Democratic Party could then use once it got stronger to help, find as many Democrats as they possibly could to turn out and vote in elections and to make them competitive in this state.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gillespie. This has been a wonderful presentation and great clarity on the analysis. We really appreciate your time and efforts here. Thank you to everyone who was able to join us tonight. This has been a great recap for us all and hopefully some clarity in a lot of media that we're consuming right now. Have a great evening. And if you are staying with us, we will begin the second session in about 8 minutes.